Is obviously a very particular client, Doug, and in that New York Times report, even describing lawyers' concern that the president has a history of making false statements and that is part of their concern of his testifying. In a world where making false statements doesn't seem to actually have many significant consequences, what would the consequences be of making false statements to Robert Mueller as part of that probe?
Yeah, it's a very good question, of course, because you're drawing the distinction, and many have said this, between, coming out of a sharp elbow business world of New York City real estate and so on, versus the much more difficult landscape of federal law enforcement. So to answer your question and address your point, you do not even have to be under oath, by the way. But in my view, the president probably would be placed under oath. Everybody talks about that. But the reality is, under U.S. federal law, we call it, 1001, 18 United States Code, Section 1001, 1001, it is a crime, a federal crime, to lie on a material matter to a law enforcement agent, even if you're not under oath. So that's the peril, and it's a serious crime. I've prosecuted those. I've defended them. I've been involved with them for years and years. So that's the peril, to answer your question.
Well, certainly Bill Clinton found that peril, Doug. But let me ask you on another point. Analysts are suggesting that if Robert Mueller wants to speak with Donald Trump directly, that could be a signal that he's reaching the climax, as it were, of his investigation, because he would be the central figure. Is that necessarily the case?
That's interesting, because people, again, are somewhat mishandicapping this, and they're not focusing on a couple of realities of law enforcement. I'm going to give some general rules, general observations, but not necessarily dispositive. Generally speaking, it behooves me to point out, seriously, that law enforcement very often doesn't seek to interview the target of the investigation, particularly if they have a very strong case. So whoever is saying that this may signal that the Mueller investigation is towards the end very well may be correct. I think that's the better interpretation. But again, it's not 100%, because we don't know the internal workings of the investigation. We don't know why the special counsel is seeking to interview the president. But again, to me, based on my 32 years, I think it does telegraph more likely than not likely that they're toward the end of it. And remember, when they interviewed Secretary Clinton toward the end of the email probe. So I draw an analogy there, guys.
Doug, briefly, I want to ask you about the other decision Trump has to make as part of the investigation, those memos, this time if he should release the Democrat memo that is meant as a counter to the Republican memo. Do you think that both of these memos on both sides are just some sort of noise in the investigation, or could they have a real impact on how the probe goes forward?
Well, they're partisan documents, to a great extent, the so-called Republican memo, the Democratic memo. I've said before, and I'll say it again, the best way to meaningfully analyze the issue would be to look at the actual FISA applications. But FISA's a secret court, and I'm not so sure that will be the case, that those will ever be made public. A couple of people apparently have reviewed the applications, and the point is, we're not sure which memo is more accurate than the other one. Now, what's interesting, though, really interesting, is that the Democratic memo is something like 10 pages, the Republican memo 4 pages. And I was seeing some material this morning, that says that the Democratic memo, is full of problematic things like, sources and methods and things like that. And again, politically, that translates into putting the president and the White House in a little bit of a difficult box, because the point is, it kind of forces him perhaps to go down a road of not wanting to release it, which is sort of exactly what they want. But having said that, look, what's good for one side is good for the other. So it'd be extremely difficult, in my opinion, for the White House to turn around and say, we just released this Republican memorandum, but no, this one we want to block. I just don't see that happening. But again, there are some problems in terms of having to redact out material and, clean it up, for lack of a better term. So
all right, and you just
my prediction,
never know.
A little crystal ball, I think it will ultimately be released.
No crystal balls in Washington in 2018. Those don't exist, I think we see. Doug Burns in New York, thanks very much for being with us. We're going to go for a quick break on the rundown. Much more when we're back. Don't go